whomever offered, must be destroyed.
November 1942, 3 years into the Second World War. America's rookie troops prepare to make landfall on the shores of French-controlled North Africa, ready to fight the Germans for the first time. But as they move off the beaches, they come under immediate and heavy fire, not from the Nazis, but from America's oldest ally, the French.
So their first experience is fighting not against an enemy, not against Axis forces, but against an old ally. And they were shot to pieces.
This is something that will always be shocking. French and American troops who should have been working together, killing one another on the beaches.
Up till this time, North Africa has been a brutal slogging match between the European powers. But this ultimately will be a crucial theater, and into it are drawn the Americans.
In this little-known desert battlefield, the United States will taste combat in extraordinary circumstances that will change the course of the Second World War. The battle for North Africa begins on the battlefields of Europe. In May 1940, Nazi Germany sweeps through northern France and reaches Paris, humbling two great European powers and allies, Britain and France. The French surrender, and the Nazis install a puppet government in the town of Vichy. And the British army is routed and chased off the beaches of Dunkirk.
So in the summer of 1940, there's widespread shock in Britain. Suddenly you've got swastikas fluttering just the other side of the channel, and it just seems so completely unthinkable. Britain in 1940 is alone to take on the Germans.
But Britain's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, is determined to fight on.
Now we are at war, and we are going to make war, and persevere in making war until the other side have had enough of it.
Right away, Churchill identifies something crucial to Britain's hopes. The country relies on her vast empire in the east for supplies, and most critically, oil. And almost all of it comes through the Suez Canal in her North African colony, Egypt. Lose the Suez, lose the war.
The British, of course, were well aware of the significance of the oil. They were well aware of the significance of the Suez Canal as a link between Europe, or the Mediterranean, and the Indian Empire, and they were determined to hold on to it at all costs.
Suez Canal is an absolutely vital supply line, and the British have been in Egypt since the 1830s, and they're not going to let it go easily.
But with Britain's main ally, France, now in German hands, the Suez suddenly looks more vulnerable than ever. Along the North African coast, a French fleet is moored at Mers el Kabir in the French colony Algeria.
Churchill has become incredibly concerned about these ships. He believes that Germany will take them. It's only a matter of time. The French Navy was the second most powerful in Europe. If it fell into Germany's hands, it would allow the Germans to control the Mediterranean, which would then shut off Britain's access to the Suez and to its empire. So for Britain, who is trying to hold out against Germany and needs those supply lines to stay open, having Germany grab the French Navy was a serious problem.
Churchill orders the Royal Navy into the Mediterranean Sea and instructs them to escort the French fleet away from North Africa. But the situation rapidly escalates.
The British admiral sends one of his officers across to talk to the French, and he gives them an ultimatum. He said, you can scuttle your ships so that the Germans don't get hold of them, or you can hand them over to us, the British. And the French admiral is pretty uncompromising himself. He's like, we're not talking about this. So the negotiations unfold through this incredibly hot day at which tempers are rising, and the tension is rising, of course, all the time. The time is given 5:30. If we haven't got an answer by 5:30, we're going to open fire. And the French are probably thinking, you know, they're not going to open fire. We're going to call their bluff. And the British 15-inch guns on their battleships open fire, and it's utter carnage. One of the French battle cruisers blows up. Two of them are so badly hit that they sink. And worse than that, killed 1,300 French sailors. And it's a betrayal, as the French see it, that they will never forget.
What Mers el-Kebir demonstrates is just how desperate the British are at this point in the war, that they're willing to turn against allies who had been fighting on their side just a week before, if you will.
But with the embers still glowing on the tragedy in Algeria, Churchill has to face up to another threat to Egypt and the Suez. Hitler's main ally, Italy, has hundreds of thousands of troops right next door in their colony, Libya. And that September, they invade and push for the Suez.
The Italians quite understandably make the calculation that having lost most of the arms of its regular army, certainly most of its equipment of the regular army at Dunkirk, the British army at that time is not in a position to properly defend its imperial interests in North Africa.
Churchill scrambles for manpower to help him fight back. His first hope was that the United States would join the war. But the American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, soon makes him realize he needs to look elsewhere.
Churchill has been trying to get President Roosevelt to help him, and Roosevelt has time and time again said, we're not going to go into another foreign European imperial war, and the American public have been very much behind that decision. Churchill realizes that public opinion in the United States is against entering the war.
But one of the interesting myths is Britain standing alone. Britain is not alone. The British Empire is the largest empire in the world. Over 300 million people, which it utilizes ruthlessly for its own advantage.
Rebuffed by America, Churchill asks the Empire and Dominions to send volunteers to fight in Egypt. Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans and Indians are all transported to North Africa to serve alongside the British Army. Part of nearly 9 million men Britain will recruit from the old empire during the Second World War. Swollen with new recruits, the British are able to stop the Italians' advance and push them right back into Libya. But Churchill won't have long to dwell on the victory.
The problem for the British then becomes, okay, well, you can do that against the Italians, but now at the very last minute, the Germans show up.
In February 1941, Hitler sends an armored force of tanks and 30,000 men to join the Italians and turn the tide in North Africa. The Germans' new Africa Corps is headed up by Hitler's former bodyguard and one of his best tank commanders, General Erwin Rommel.
Rommel gets flown into North Africa because he's one of Hitler's favorites. He's performed very well in Poland and France, and Hitler really likes him. He's very, very close to Hitler, and Hitler admires him. He does have the qualifications that Hitler wants, both a daring do, handsome, quick thinking.
Erwin Rommel thinks outside the box. He is great at improvisation. He has an uncanny intuition for exploiting an opportunity. He is also very narcissistic. He promotes this cult of himself.
Rommel is heading out to Africa with a well-drilled military doctrine from his victories in Europe. Fast panzer tanks and mobile infantry work together to rapidly outmaneuver the enemy. And as soon as Rommel arrives in the desert, he sees that the harsh alien terrain is the perfect setting for his form of warfare.
You know, on the face of it, conditions out in the desert are terrible. The weather is uniformly hot and oppressive during the day. The flies are awful. The food is bad. But if you're a tank commander like Rommel, who is one of the foremost proponents of maneuver-based warfare and really understands how armored warfare works, because the spaces are so wide open, this is a golden opportunity.
Within days of arriving in Libya, Rommel launches a surprise attack on the British lines. His fast, aggressive tactics and tanks are too much for the inexperienced British and Imperial troops.
And what Rommel is able to do is act with enormous decisiveness. And he goes, right, we're just going to do this, and we're going to hammer in, and we're not going to worry about our flanks, we're just going to go hell for leather, shoot up everything we see.
He uses incredibly aggressive tactics. You see Rommel do this in the Desert War by ranging way, way beyond the initial defensive positions of the British to cause havoc in their rear. In other words, you create psychological havoc by getting into the rear of your enemies.
German forces relentlessly attack the British army over 400 miles back to the border. But just as it looks like Rommel might ride right into the heart of Egypt and towards the Suez Canal, he's held up. A hardy corps of Australian troops are dug in the Libyan port town of Tobruk.
Tobruk is this tiny little port, kind of sort of eastern side in Libya. It's very hard to attack that because you've got to attack over this kind of sort of big open space. You've got huge minefields and wire, and you've got dominating gun positions. It makes it a very, very tough nut to crack from the desert. That's a big problem for Rommel, because you're going to have to deal with it before you go all the way into Egypt.
Is going to be a relatively bloodless victory, which is his assault on Tobruk, is repulsed not only once but twice by the Australians. So the Australians, who are incredibly poorly disciplined, they don't salute senior officers, they look pretty slovenly. But when it comes to actual fighting, they are very good at it.
Yeah, we made it a title of honour to be the rats of Tobruk who would not be caught.
For Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the defiance of Tobruk is a vital positive in a difficult campaign.
Although Tobruk has had a pretty good bashing, it still holds out. More than that, it's a real thorn in the enemy's side. The spirit of Tobruk's gallant defenders is indomitable.
With Tobruk holding out, the British forces in Egypt eventually regroup. And in the spring of 1942, they dig in and build vast defenses in the desert to support Tobruk and hold the line. But Rommel has a plan to break the deadlock. On the 26th of May, he drives his Africa Corps south through the desert and into the rear of the British defensive line.
He manages to surprise the British with extreme daring and with his sense of exploiting opportunities.
Suddenly, the kind of contagion of defeat sweeps through the British army and people start to cut and run. What you get now is suddenly everything starts to kind of disintegrate.
The British forces in the desert flee eastwards. And the town of Tobruk is left isolated and hopelessly surrounded. After holding out for 400 days, it finally falls. 30,000 British and Imperial troops are taken prisoner. And the legend of Rommel, the Desert Fox, is born.
One or two of our people were captured. They were astonished to see Rommel appear. One of the questions was, have they gotten any complaints? There was a tremendous admiration for the man. I mean, he became the sort of Wonder Man, Superman.
Rommel taking Tobruk seems to even further reinforce the Rommel myth, like this idea of this general who's astonishing and dashing and can take whatever he wants, and then the Germans will soon be at the Suez Canal.
With Tobruk neutralized, Rommel pushes deep into Egypt and up to the last fortified British defensive line at El Alamein. He is now within striking distance of the vital Suez Canal. Churchill is at a conference in the United States when he hears the news.
The British have made a great play about the defense of Tobruk and holding off against Rommel. And the fact that it collapses so quickly and spectacularly in 1942, I think, is something quite difficult.
The loss of Tobruk really chills Churchill to his bones, and he comes out with one of the great lines of the Second World War, which is, defeat is one thing, disgrace is another.
But amongst the bad news, there is one ray of hope for the Prime Minister. His hosts, the United States, are now in the war as allies. And President Roosevelt is keen to help.
So while the loss of Tobruk was a bit of a horror show for Churchill, he was also able to say, look, North Africa's important, you know, the Egypt's now under threat.
And Churchill says, listen, why don't you come into North Africa? And Roosevelt is convinced and persuaded by Churchill.
Roosevelt tells Churchill he does want to send US forces to North Africa. But when the plan is put to American military chiefs, they hit a problem. The United States Army isn't battle-ready yet. And Roosevelt's advisors are very unsure if North Africa is the right place to enter combat.
Many in his own government were very, very against it. There's a huge debate in the United States as to what the states should do.
For the American commanders, it's a sideshow that is going to end up consuming more and more resources, and that is dangerous.
Under pressure from his advisors, Roosevelt tells Churchill he can't commit to North Africa right away. But he promises fresh consignments of US material and weapons to British forces in the region.
Roosevelt's now commitment to North Africa, one of the things he does is that, okay, where do our tanks go? Our tanks are going to go to North Africa. And if they can't be used by American troops right away, they're going to be used by British troops.
Churchill leaves America determined to turn the tide in Egypt and prove the president is right to support him. He flies out to the desert in person and fires his senior commanders. And recruits General Bernard Montgomery instead. Monty is told to come up with a plan to push the Germans back.
Well, Montgomery is a bit of a kind of Marmite character. You either kind of sort of love him or hate him. He's a very good trainer of men. He's a very good planner. When they go into battle, they're going to win. You know, boringly, methodically.
He was almost the opposite of Rommel. He was not good when the battle was moving at speed. His style was a set-piece battle, which he set up.
On the 23rd of October, 1942, Montgomery launches a counteroffensive. He chooses to attack at night. But to break out of El Alamein, his men will need to clear a path through a lethal minefield of over 500,000 landmines.
were falling all round about you. Machine gun bullets were flying all over the place. Although the moonlight was bright, inevitably somebody would actuate tripwire.
Exposed and moving slowly, the British take heavy casualties. But over the next few days, narrow corridors are successfully cleared through the minefield. And now, bursting out of El Alamein onto the battlefield, a stunning show of force from President Roosevelt. An iron fist of 300 brand new American tanks.
It is a gift from Roosevelt to Churchill, really. It is a sign of the new partnership.
Montgomery had, for the first time, he had a really effective tank. The Sherman, it was very solid, it had good armament, and it was quite quick.
Aided by the might of American machinery, Montgomery's forces now outnumber the Germans. Rommel's Africa Corps are caught off guard, and it looks like they could be engulfed and destroyed.
These crucial opportunities where Rommel is prone, or at least is very, very vulnerable, which are a matter of hours. You know, you've got to strike when the Germans are at their weakest. There was a real opportunity, if Montgomery had been decisive, that he could have inflicted a really crushing defeat. But that wasn't his style.
What Montgomery doesn't want to do is lose his cohesion. So he's a bit slow and a bit more methodical, and he doesn't kind of pursue fast enough.
While Montgomery dithers, Rommel takes decisive action. He pulls back to mountainous Tunisia, 1,000 miles to the west, and prepares to counterstrike the British army. But the Desert Fox should be looking over his shoulder. Off the northwest coast of Africa, a vast transport fleet appears on the horizon. America is about to enter the war with Operation Torch.
It was a very impressive sight. This is really the first great American war fleet now being sent into action against the Axis. Given the fact that this whole thing was thrown together in 2 months' time, I think demonstrates that the U.S. is on the verge of superpower status.
850 warships, carrying over 100,000 men, have rendezvoused in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and borne down on North Africa. The world's first ever large-scale amphibious invasion force.
Really, it's extraordinary, particularly at that moment in the war. A lot of the ships are coming fresh out of the shipyard. A lot of the crews are incredibly green, and yet it still works.
But President Roosevelt's decision to join the fight in North Africa has not been easy. His commanders wanted to fight the Nazis in occupied Europe. And the president has been forced to overrule them with a direct order.
The president is the commander-in-chief. And Roosevelt doesn't want to invade Nazi Europe too quickly. He believes it would be too bloody, too difficult, and you might end up with mass American casualties. The invasion of North Africa suits Roosevelt because the American army can bed in. It will give us combat experience. We will learn the lessons, because we are an inexperienced army. Everyone else has been at war for many years.
And Winston Churchill has sold Roosevelt a major advantage for blooding his troops in North Africa. The American amphibious assault can make landfall not in Axis territory, but in Algeria and Morocco, colonies controlled by the French.
The belief is that the French will welcome us with open arms as liberators.
Hitler, after all, has invaded their country and then created this puppet government, this Vichy France. And, you know, who, if you're French, would not want to get rid of this?
There's such a long-standing history of friendship between the U.S. and France, fighting alongside one another.
President Roosevelt beams a speech in French over colonial radio to greet America's old friends.
Mes amis, vive la France éternelle.
On the morning of the 8th of November, the first stage of the US landings begins. A small force of just over 400 American troops in 2 British Royal Navy ships moved to peacefully take control of the Algerian port of Oran. But things do not go according to plan.
Even though these ships are coming in flying American flags and broadcasting, you know, don't shoot, we're Americans, the French immediately open fire on them and just rake them from stem to stern. It's pretty horrible.
And it's an absolute bloodbath. About 700 Allied soldiers lose their lives, mostly American, but also Royal Navy are killed in this operation, and it's a total fiasco. The French had never forgiven the British for sinking part of their fleet at Mers el-Kabir, which of course is in French North Africa, in 1940, directly after the armistice. And it's the Americans that are paying the price.
Churchill's decision to sink the French fleet in Algeria 2 years before has come home to roost for the Allies. Along the coast in Casablanca, Morocco, a French fleet sorties from port to engage the American Navy in open combat.
The Battle of Casablanca is no-holds-barred naval warfare. By the time the Americans are done with the French fleet, Casablanca Harbor is a cemetery. It doesn't really fit nicely into the triumphant narrative that we like to tell ourselves about World War II, because there is no easy way to square the fact that the Americans and the British fought the French. But the French still shot at American soldiers. The French still defended their colonies. They are defending their home.
But as American troops start to make landfall in large numbers, the local leaders of the puppet Vichy French regime have a difficult decision to make. Stay loyal to their Nazi overlords, or let the Americans in.
And the big fear of a lot of people in French North Africa. What happens if Nazi Germany exert pressure on them? Because Germany has 2 million French POWs that it consistently uses as leverage against the Vichy regime to get what it wants.
It was a very, very complicated situation. They're not sure what the implications are going to be if the Americans come in. There's a lot of infighting, and they start changing their minds.
To the point where the Americans are now about to launch a final devastating attack against Casablanca, which would have killed hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians in the process. Finally, we get the word that the supreme French commander in North Africa, Admiral Darlan, has said, go ahead and lay down your arms. So it is only that prevents much wider bloodshed.
After a few days, all French resistance to Operation Torch ceases. And as 100,000 men disembark, the French forces start to work side by side with the Allies.
North Africa is really a turning point for France in the war. It's when France goes to joining the Allied cause. We're fighting for France to be a state again, fighting for France to be something other than a vassal of Nazi Germany.
And as cargo pours off the Allied ships, it quickly becomes apparent that there is a new American way of waging war.
We bring everything. Tractors, barbed wire, hospital components, railroad ties, railroad engines. They even sent 6 tons of lingerie to bargain with the locals to get favors. So that is also true. It's crazy, The Americans don't solve their problems, they overwhelm them.
But America's huge invasion force will have to wait to prove its power. They've landed over 1,000 miles from Rommel's forces in Tunisia. And just as they arrive, the onset of winter turns mountainous French North Africa into an impassable quagmire. At the same time, Montgomery and the British advance from the east is also getting bogged down. With the Allies moving slowly on both fronts, Rommel has time to resupply and plot his next move.
The question is, should he go against Monty and the 8th Army first, or should he attack the Americans first? And he makes the decision that he's going to go against the Americans first. And why? Because first of all, they're not yet at full strength, and they're possibly easy to beat.
The American units in many cases are composed of recruits who less than a year ago were shop clerks or mechanics or farmers.
There's plenty of people who are arriving on the beaches of North Africa who've never even seen a tank, let alone trained with one. Those American troops are really, really green.
And as the US forces move east towards Tunisia, even their commander, General Lloyd Fredendall, is experiencing the campaign trail for the first time.
I don't know whether it's suddenly this responsibility, whether he just completely freaks out. I don't know what it is, but he starts acting very oddly.
He seems to use a very strange code language so that nobody can really understand what he's saying.
So, for example, move your command, i.e. the Walking Boys, Pop Guns, Baker's outfit, and the big fellows, to M. Have your boys report to the French gentleman whose name begins with J at a place which begins with D, which is 5 grid squares to the left of M. And it turned out in the field, he did not have a good understanding of the battlefield conditions, and therefore was a disaster when he actually came up against the Germans.
In February 1943, Fredendall reaches the Atlas Mountains, and he sends his rookie infantry forward into a narrow pass with no reconnaissance and no support. They're ambushed by Rommel's crack Africa Corps. It's a massacre.
There's no way of you knowing where they're shooting from. We had airplanes shooting at us, tanks shooting at us, just like shooting ducks.
Bullets were zipping over, and my men were falling dead. The guy behind me was shot straight through that middle of the forehead.
They're in the middle of this pass. They can't get out. They can't really turn around. And the force that Rommel brings on them is absolutely terrifying. The terrible thing for the troops was seeing for the first time people dying in front of them, their buddies dying in combat. They hadn't seen this before.
This is a moral success, maybe, for Rommel. Inferior in numbers and tanks and in almost everything, but creating essentially a nervous breakdown on the other side.
There are over 3,000 US casualties in under 48 hours. The same number again are taken prisoner. It's a harsh lesson for the Americans.
Okay, now this is what war is. It's merciless, it's arbitrary, and you cannot be an amateur at this. So, North Africa was a necessary evil for the Americans. To learn our craft, to figure out what it was going to be like to actually fight the Germans.
This, after all, had been one of the reasons that Roosevelt had argued for them landing in North Africa, so that they could have some battle experience before they did go and tackle the Hitler's Reich.
Days after the battle, Fredendorf is unceremoniously fired. The American High Command digs into its list of names for a new commander, and they come up with General George S. Patton.
What North Africa does is it begins to reveal the strengths and weaknesses of different American officers. There is no officer who really competes with General George Patton for being the enlightening rod of American warfighting.
So he gets out a real can of whoop-ass to beat them into shape and turn them into a fighting unit again very, very quickly, and he's successful at it.
He's sometimes very vulgar. He pees into every river he crosses and makes a point of it. But he has charisma among his troops, and he loves to push forward.
General Patton has been a tank commander as far back as World War I, and he quickly proves to be a genius with mobile warfare, pioneering aggressive American tank maneuvers.
Patton's a daring risk-taker to try and do outlandish things. And so Patton provides an antidote to traditional American officers.
He is ferociously aggressive, he is highly technical, and so he's one of the great practitioners of tank warfare within this war. And he's perfectly capable of being put on the same plane as a Rommel.
At last, Germany's Desert Fox meets his match. In unrelenting lightning-fast attacks, Patton drives his armored column deep into Tunisia. And in March 1943, he outflanks and splits the enemy's western front. Meanwhile, Britain's General Montgomery has finally reached the region from the east. Rommel and the Axis forces are caught between an anvil and a hammer.
German and Italian army in Tunisia is going to just be ground down by superior Allied firepower until they can no longer resist.
General Erwin Rommel can now see that the writing is on the wall in North Africa.
No matter how hard he tries, no matter how good he might be, no matter what he does, he can't succeed. And that feeling leads to a kind of a breakdown, both physically breaking down, but also mentally. He goes into a depression. He has to go back on sick leave to Germany to recover.
Rommel is flown out. It was convenient to have him absent when things were not going well. It's almost too big to fail.
Abandoned by their talismanic commander, on the 13th of May 1943, the strangled Axis forces in Tunisia are finally forced to surrender. $230,000 German and Italian troops, including the famed Africa Corps, are taken prisoner by the Allies. It will prove one of the largest single surrenders in the entire course of the war. In the coming years, Rommel will face a spectacular fall from grace within the Nazi regime, implicated in a plot to assassinate Hitler.
Rommel gets a message from the secret police that they want him to commit suicide. And they threaten that if he doesn't, his family would get arrested, including his children, and potentially abused, tortured. So he took the poison that was provided to him. He got a hero's funeral, and this was all kept a secret.
But for Britain and America, this is their first victory. After 3.5 years of fighting, combat between 5 different nations, and soldiers from around the world, the Allies finally control the whole of North Africa. And on this vast desert battlefield, the scales of war have finally begun to tip in the Allies' favor.
You know, if you see North Africa as a sort of testing ground, a proving ground for British and, of course, American troops as well, then it's a massive tick in the box. Because obviously they've had setbacks, yet they've learned from it. And by the end, you've got Allied forces that's working together as a coalition.
Those British were clapping our hands, and we were them too, and happy. Get over here, Yank, and have tea with us. Oh, that was a celebration in Tunis.
This has been a long, hard road, but a determined conflict, which has come good for the Allies. And it is a great turning point in the war. Churchill says it himself.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.